I think it's a good time for us to start our seminar. So welcome to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs seminars. And my name is Margarita Zawadzka. I'm new here, so it's been 2 months. I joined FIA as a senior research fellow. My major is in Russian politics and authoritarian states in general. And I will be chairing today's seminars and today's discussion. We also have two distinguished speakers today, and I'm very happy to introduce Jussi Lassila, Senior Research Fellow at the FIA, and I guess his presentation will be inspired by a very recent briefing paper, Russia's regime transformation and the invasion of Ukraine from a failed blitzkrieg to war as the new normal. Well, and then our guest speaker, Professor Andreas Umland, who actually has two hats. So, and I guess you're joining us from Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. So, who is the analyst at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, associate professor at the National University of Cape Mahila Academy. So, let's agree to have approximately 20 minutes for each speaker. So, I'll keep an eye on the timing. Then I will do my best to give you comments and ask some nasty questions, and then I'll open the floor to our audience. So this is the format for today's discussion. So, and without any further ado, let me give the floor to Jussi Lassila. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Margarita, and hello to everyone. So, as Margarita mentioned, yes, I'm going to wrap up this recent briefing paper that was published in last Thursday, if I remember correctly, and put those four major points I made, and start with maybe mention the title, that how the war has become a kind of new normal, regardless of these difficulties and kind of cumulative problems what we have seen over the course of the year. So instead of Putin's position dramatically weakening or even collapsing after the failure of a blitzkrieg, as many assumed, we now see how the protracted war, despite of these incredible and unprecedented casualties, has become and is becoming a kind of key additional aspect for Putin's legitimacy. So it seems that the war has largely stripped away those formal institutional facets which the informal governance has been somewhat covered. And now it seems that this personalistic authoritarianism with its mafia-like elements appear to be barer than ever before. Although the decision of full-scale invasion was exceptional in terms of Putin's previous actions, especially in terms of foreign policy, which sought to avoid too excessive risks, now the outcome and the invasion can be seen as the culmination of a regression in Russia's domestic political developments. Essential to this regression has been the weakened ability of an aging regime to kind of manipulate the societal changes according to its interests in the modern information space or kind of global circumstances. This kind of manipulation, or spin dictatorship, as Daniel Treisman and Sergei Guriev call it, was a trademark of early Putinism and of Medvedev's presidency, a kind of soft authoritarianism. So this actually reveals the kind of a regression, or some call an authoritarian evolution of these developments. So, for example, the regime's attitude of the main oppositional rival, or Putin's rival, Alexei Navalny, leading to his eventual poisoning in 2020, can be seen as an example that although the threat of color revolutions and the representatives of Fifth Column has long been present in the Kremlin's security policies, softer means are no longer seen as effective in combating this threat. So activities of domestic opposition began to be seen more and more clearly through the prism of 2014 Ukrainian revolution and 2020 uprising in Belarus, if before or prior to that, the major kind of reference was 2004 Orange Revolution, also in Ukraine. Eventually, Putin's deepening isolation as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic paved the way for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a final solution of the risk of color revolutions, conspired by the West, as pointed by Putin himself, just before the invasion, namely the widespread protests in Kazakhstan in January 2022. And now, as Putin has not backed down in his goals, despite the failure of the Blitzkrieg and the unprecedented costs, it has become obvious that the war is being turned into a new foundation for regime's legitimacy. So in this respect, given the regime's gradual transition to increasingly repressive policies, continuing the war and making it a new normal appears to be safer option for the regime's logic than ending the war without significant gains. So second point, so this Russia's increasingly dictatorial and Soviet nostalgic political leadership sees the invasion not only as a necessity when it comes to prevailing in the conflict with the West, but also a chance, an opportunity to break free from Western influences. So as the war drags on, Russia's inexorable isolation from West can be seen a more profound return to Soviet-era practices. This is definitely not a new thing. We have seen over the course of the Putin's 20-year reign, a lot of debates about the school teaching, especially around the patriotic education, history education, all kinds of plans to kind of reestablish variety of Soviet practices. But this is also seen as a kind of policy debate between the kind of reformers and more kind of conservative circles, especially between the generations, between the ministries. And now, in this situation, the war has provided a kind of ideological anchor for unimpeded return of Soviet-era practices, but also following the circumstances when the actual isolation is dragging society back to the past when Western connections were cut off. Now it's a kind of necessity or kind of a circumstances which kind of facilitate this kind of process. So in this respect, the Kremlin's views on the full liberation from the Western influences should be seen as being in line with the longer authoritarian developments culminating in the war, and not solely as the rhetorical cover-ups of defeats as they are sometimes and I think quite often represented in the West, that all these are some sort of a cover-ups and these are negative tendencies. They certainly are in the bigger picture, but I think that the core elite is increasingly seeing this as a kind of an opportunity. So the ambitions of the Soviet nostalgic political leadership are increasingly, in this respect, combined with the realities inflicted by the deepening isolation, while sufficient counterforces to the critical understanding of these realities are missing, not least to the total repression of the civil society, but also the kind of fear of any kind of collective action or counter arguments among the political establishment and the elite. Maybe the only exception what we could mention in this respect is related to the financial sector, and particularly in the macroeconomic management, where, for instance, in the central bank, Nabiulyeva and others are true kind of experts, and this following the kind of meritocratic criteria in handling those major shocks. But in other sectors, we do definitely see the kind of increasing Sovietization and seeing that as a kind of a role model for future's Russia. Then a third point related to the Putin's role as a referee in the elites competition, and that has been transformed into a more or less open and not previously seen rivalry in the context of the war. So the competition over who is the most loyal to Putin's war policy radicalizes the political discourse throughout. So besides the Russian state propaganda, the highest political elite, including Putin himself, have started cultivating increasingly radical rhetoric as the war of aggression has dragged on. For example, a year ago, in March 22, Putin talked about eliminating countries' internal enemies, comparing them to insects, and about the national need to cleanse ourselves of these harmful substances. Just recently, this week, 2 days ago, Putin instructed the FSB to fight scum on our land that is trying to split our Russian society. Repeated references to Ukraine posing the existential threat to Russia and framing the war as a necessary civilizational clash with the West are undeniably akin to fascist rhetoric. It's an open question, however, as to whether Putin's regime can become truly fascist, as that would require broad bottom-up nationalist movement permitted by the regime, as well as the future-oriented revolutionary ideology. And this is certainly not the case, at least so far. So in contrast, I think Putin's past-looking regime is still or even more afraid of any genuine civic participation and relies on politically apathetic population. But I suppose Andreas will provide some important viewpoints to this matter. Widely echoed expectations at the beginning of the war about technocrats and formal liberals detaching themselves from the regime's war front have turned out to be wrong. This may still happen as the problems deepen, but so far, however, the war has not changed the foundations of the Putin's mafia state rule. I think they have made it more clear even in this case. The most important issue is still dependence on Putin as patron and showing loyalty to him despite the dramatically changed circumstances. The new thing is that in the past, loyalty shown to the president also meant loyalty to the unified image of the regime and the system, despite mutual tensions among its members, which used to be also the central feature of the rule and divide policies of Putin. But now Putin's isolated autocracy, the elite's uncertainty about the president's intentions and the unclear outcome of the war have driven many members of the elite to highlight their positions. And there are a variety of examples of that, and the worth mentioning, of course, the former president and the prime minister, incumbent deputy chairman of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who has certainly descended into an insane rhetoric, is the kind of primary example. And I think his radicalization can be explained by his position related to national security, which he evidently interprets as a requirement to demonstrate obedience to the president and to signal the other members of the elite of his importance. But what is interesting that what kind of reactions these crazy rants have caused. And one case is, for example, the conflict between Medvedev and the Federal Council Senator Andrei Klishas, where Medvedev suggested that we should not follow any more laws in this kind of situation in terms of punishing the national traitors, where Klishas responded the importance of laws still in this sense. So this is very important that Klishas himself has been the main authority in the making of repressing laws in recent years, strengthening Putin's dictatorial position. So that is to say, Klishas' talk in defense of the law should be seen as stemming from the need to defend his position in the current situation as a central architect of the Putin's authoritarian legalism, rather than from desire to uphold the rule of law as a counterpole to Medvedev's vigilant views. And similar conflict emerged, for instance, between Senator and Secretary of the General Council of the United Russia Party, Andrei Turchak, and the Duma Speaker, Vyacheslav Volodin, where Volodin criticized Turchak for being absent from Duma sessions and for highlighting the importance of Duma, while Turchak was traveling in occupied territories, where Turchak claimed that it was his patriotic duty and suggested that Volodin and Duma were out of touch of reality. So these are kind of unprecedented outcomes. They are not new. Of course, they reveal these existing tensions, but now there seems to be an opportunity and kind of a necessity to demonstrate those. And of course, there's a wider talk about Yevgeny Prigozhin, this mercenary Wagner figure and leader and figure behind numerous pro-Putin troll media outlets. His kind of attacks against well-known Putin allies like Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov. And I think this demonstrates the same ruthless kind of behavior as Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov. And both have demonstrated their loyalty of the Putin, as in Kadyrov's case, also his kind of irreplaceable position as a guarantor of stability in Chechnya. And the current situation offers an excellent opportunity to accentuate their position at the expense of the difficulties and incompetence of other players. A new feature in this Prigozhin game is also the appearance of other private mercenaries by some oligarch groups, which in the picture of this larger strategic goals is quite interesting, because I think it demonstrates their own kind of separate war efforts at the cost of the bigger strategic picture. And I think this fits also play with this sort of a loyalty game towards Putin. So in general, the fascist-like language used by certain members of the elite, and especially by the state propaganda, and embodied in the actions of Prigozhin and Kadyrov in particular, is a result of the loyalty game played by Putin's mafia state in the context of war, adapting to it and exploiting it. And finally, the final point is this, which is what I would see here, that the main challenge of the Kremlin vis-a-vis the society is to maintain the balance between the citizens' political apathy and the increasing needs for further mobilization required times of the war. So as we do know, the civic passivity is central to the regime's security, while justifying the continuation of the poorly progressing war requires an increasing militarization of society. So widespread approval of Putin and his policies notwithstanding, the Russian people have not been particularly enthusiastic about engaging personally with the war. So the attitudes are actually much more blatant and passive if we compare it to the effects what we see after the seizure of the Crimea. By March, April 22, after the major failure to take Kyiv, Russian support for the special military operation had already declined. The number of Russians who definitely support Russian military actions in Ukraine, which is this official formulation, was 41% in December 22, which is the hitherto lowest proportion so far. And I think the latest figure in January was 45. However, in the last year, March, the figure was 52. So moreover, the state propaganda efforts to brainwash people into adopting the revenge mentality have proved to be partly counterproductive. And for instance, in the last summer, the viewership of the three most important state television channels fell more than 20%. And the lack of willingness to contribute personally to the state's war efforts became obvious in September, when Putin launched the vaguely defined partial mobilization. The repressed civil society and the weak tradition of collective action in Russia are channeled either into emigration or, as in the most case of Russians, into deepening withdrawal from society, rather than into a strengthening belief in mass organization against the regime. And this is also some kind of an expectations which maybe all became a kind of a surprise and a major disapproval, frustration for the Western observers. The deepening retreat from everything related to politics is manifested in Russians' diminishing willingness to answer all kinds of surveys. And this is also the big debate, and Margarita is especially an expert in this regard. So, for instance, according to an independent pollster, since the beginning of the war, the number of refusals has increased by 25%, and the rate of survey abandonment has increased by 34%. A third of which were abandoned related when the direct question about the support for the special military operation was posed. In total, the average rate of refusal has been approximately 88% during the war. And of course, this called the question of reliability of surveys in general. And this is actually in a big debate at the moment. What was partially surprising was also the lack of active commitment of Putin's war among the political establishment. In February 22, 2 days before the invasion, 50 Duma deputies out of 450, of which 42 were from United Russia Party, were not present during the vote for the recognition for the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So this was actually major casus belli for the war, or this official justification. But regardless of that, although not a single deputy abstained, let alone vote against, the number of absent deputies implies at least very serious indifference to the official justification. More importantly, on 3rd of October 22, when the Duma ratified the annexation of 4 regions to Russia, approximately 40 deputies were absent during each of the votes for the regions. And this is an even clearer indication of indifference, since it can no longer be unclear to any deputy what the issue concerns. It's highly likely that in the February vote, none of them, if any, were aware of what were the Putin's intentions. This passivity may be the reason why an United Russia has announced that it will expel from the party those rank-and-file members who have not supported the war. This sends, at least whatever the outcome will be, but anyway, it signals for the more influential members of the party what is the rule of the game in the current situation. Simultaneously, the party is preparing for the year's regional elections by nominating recent war veterans as candidates. And this actually indicates that the forthcoming elections, this year's regional elections and the 24 presidential elections, will be held around the topic of the war, because it's obvious that those systemic opposition parties will do the same, and there's a kind of competition as in who will have the most kind of pro-war candidates to kind of competing against each other. So to quickly to conclude, the regime's interests lies in the war, while the consequences of which are and will be suffered by the citizens in their everyday lives. While the majority of citizens prefer to retreat from the reality of war through non-commitment, the regime has a worsening problem on its hands. The shift towards wider militarization of society, accompanied by the hardships of the war, will likely provoke the personal demobilization of citizens as long as there are opportunities to do so. So far, this seems to be working, as the recent Levada polls, I think in last month, shows that 70% of citizens announce that they feel happy and self-confident at the moment. And I think this is, of course, the result of that there is still space for this sort of withdrawal from the current situation. However, it is uncertain what the public's reactions will be when there is no further leeway for personal withdrawal. This most likely is the main reason why the regime, including its propaganda machinery, is trying to avoid overly extensive warmongering from time to time. Support of the war is still high, but the downward trend is support, especially in connection with visible losses, reveals society's growing indifference to the war. And it's obvious that Putin is hungry for quick victories to resolve this dilemma. Hence, the fastest road to undermining his war-based legitimacy is to prevent these victories. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jussi, for a very succinct and insightful analysis of the current situation, what's going on in Russia, especially given the fact that we have very limited access to what's going on at the moment as researchers, which is a great obstacle for our analysis. But now I'm very happy to give the floor to Andreas Umland. So Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My little presentation is going to be, I think, a good addition to Jussi's, because I'm going to do basically three things differently than him. First, I'm not going to review a publication I have already published, but rather preview a publication that I still want to publish. And I'm also looking therefore forward to critique and to suggestions and additions that I may still be able to include. I also want to talk more about terminological issues here, and in that way add what Jussi has empirically provided here that frees me also from going into this deeper. And whereas Jussi has mainly talked about the war and its effects, I want to talk more about the regime, and which is also in the title of our panel. And so this is going to be complementary. When one talks about terminology, this is, of course, always a very tricky issue, because terminology concepts are usually very important for intellectuals, for researchers, for ordinary people. But in fact, terms and concepts, they are not true or untrue. They are a matter of agreement. You cannot prove that some term is true or untrue. It's just a matter of our sort of agreement, and they have a certain heuristic value. They have a certain utility to recognize something. They may have a practical utility to compare something adequately, but they are much less clearly established than causal statements, where one can verify and falsify causal statements. That's not in the same way possible for terminology. So the paradigm that, as I see it, was dominant until a few years ago for the analysis of Russian politics was basically the same that was dominant for the whole, or for most, let's say, of the post-Soviet, if one still is ready to use the term, perhaps even parts of the post-communist realm. This is the paradigm of sort of neo-patrimonialism. Perhaps the most influential work here was by Henry Hale, Patronal Politics, but also researchers like in Helsinki, for instance, Vladimir Gelman. They sort of supported this interpretation of Russian affairs in this sort of post-Soviet neo-patrimonial, clientelistic, patronalistic setup where politics is largely seen as a sort of interplay between informal clans and formal institutions and the fight for power. In Russian studies, Russian political studies, if you like, Россияведение, there was then an equivalent sort of paradigm in that, for instance, expressed in a book called The Code of Putinism, that Putinism is not an ideology, but a mentality, as it was expressed in this book. And so that was also something that sort of created this sort of feeling that this is all similar to the other post-Soviet countries, to Ukraine, to Central Asian countries, the South Caucasian countries, and that has then, I would say, a few years ago started to change. Jussi has emphasized here the role of the war in the change, I would say, of the sort of setup of the regime. I would say that perhaps the change can be dated even earlier. So some people say that Putin's essay of 2021 about Ukrainians and Russians was the sort of cutoff point. I would go even further back a little bit to 2020 with the change of the constitution and Putin's 2020 essay about the history of World War II, published in the National Interest, and sort of reinterpreting this period. And then there was actually this odd phenomenon that this essay by Putin was here in Germany, I'm now speaking from Berlin, was recommended by the Russian embassy in Germany to German history departments, that they would use Putin's essay in the National Interest as a sort of a secondary source, as a relevant analysis for World War II and what was around that. And what we have now, I think, I don't know how you see and Margarita, how you see it, we have now a panoply of concepts that are floating around and that are trying to sort of capture what we are observing. And this, of course, this sort of cacophony of diverse terms is sort of continuing also in view of the fact that the regime itself seems to be in flux. So it's already different also during the war. The war certainly was a cutoff point, but even during the war, the rhetoric is changing. The ideology is also perhaps evolving. Jussi has illustrated that with a few quotes from different actors of the regime. But now we are, at least I feel, somewhat lost in the different concepts that are now used, the different terms with which people try to capture this imperialism, totalitarianism, colonialism, corporatism, neo-Sovietism, spin dictatorship, what Jussi mentioned. And so I'm not going to deal with all of these terms, but rather with the one that I'm most familiar with and that I've written about before a lot, and that is the term of fascism that has now become fashionable. The whole comparison with interwar ultranationalist regimes is an old one of the sort of interwar situation in Europe and the post-Cold War situation in Russia. The earliest essay I'm aware of was one by Leonid Lux from 1990, when the Soviet Union still existed, where he already suggested the comparison with Weimar Germany. So since 1990, perhaps even earlier, we have this comparative framework that there is something here similar to the interwar situation. And oddly here, of course, when people say fascism, what they often mean is not actually Italian fascism that gave the sort of generic phenomenon its word, but rather German fascism, although, Germany then is called Nazism. But the sort of the reference here that most people have in the mind is actually interwar and wartime Germany. There was then in the 1990s a debate about the applicability of the concept of fascism for post-Soviet Russia at all. For instance, a leading sociologist from St. Petersburg, Maxim, now I forgot his name. Anyway, so he had an article called Izobretaya Ruski Fascism, sort of creating or imagining or sort of artificially creating Russian fascism as a concept that would mislead people. There was then also a well-noted discussion in post-Soviet affairs between, on the one hand, Stephen Hansen and Jeff Kopstein, and on the other hand, Stephen Shenfield, about the Weimar Russia comparison. And after Putin then became president, this whole debate was then dominated by the sort of the American political scientist with Ukrainian roots, Alexander Motyl, who had then has since the mid-2000s then proposed the term fascism for the Putinist regime. And he has, then published almost every year in different languages an essay where he argued that the regime is either proto-fascist or semi-fascist or pre-fascist, and then later on he actually said it's actually now fully fascist. And the basis for this definition or classification of this period in the evolvement of Putinism was a very simplistic and, I would say, misleading definition of fascism as basically an authoritarian system with a charismatic leader. And this broad definition would then actually mean that much of world history was actually fascist, because that is a definition that would then be applicable to many other regimes. And Motyl has actually argued that, for instance, the regime of Ataturk was fascist, yeah, and then then the term in a way loses its usefulness, because it's then becomes then actually a term that does not any longer specify what was specific about German Nazism or the Iron Guard in Romania or Italian fascism. So Motyl was largely isolated with that, has been criticized by myself and by others. Marlene Laurel has written a whole book about this issue and criticized, among others, Motyl for his argument. But since the start of the war, we are again in this discussion, and now I would say with much more justification, marked perhaps by the switch of Timothy Snyder to the fascist classification of the Putinist regime. Snyder had already before made these sort of connections between fascism and even Nazism and Putin, but he had never classified the regime as fascist. And then after the large invasion on 24th of February last year, he came out as saying, now this is actually fascism. And Jussi has, as I mentioned already, provided some illustration for why that could be justified, because the rhetoric has changed, and we have now actually in statements of various representatives of the regime these references to fascism. And something that Snyder and others have emphasized is here the infatuation of Putin with an emigre thinker called Ivan Ilyin, who in the interwar period had clearly expressed sympathy for fascism and even for the German fascist regime, and who has become now a reference point, repeatedly a reference point for Putin, in, among others, the speech that Putin gave in September last year in connection with the annexation of the 4 mainland regions of Ukraine. So we have now this new debate. I think it's now much more justified than it was earlier, when Motyl was the main proponent of this term. If again to return for a second to Motyl, one would now have to probably term, if one takes Motyl's approach seriously, one would now have to probably talk about super fascism or mega fascism or giga fascism in Russia, because if one thinks that the regime has actually changed from, let's say, before 2020, with the change of the constitution, the essays by Putin and others, and the large invasion of last year. But I think the term has now gained much more justification, and Snyder has provided a number of arguments why this is possible. In the tradition that I'm coming out of, and that is sort of institutionally expressed in the International Association for Comparative Fascist Studies, that was founded a few years ago, and the journal Fascism, called Journal for Comparative Fascist Studies, the classification of the current regime in Russia as fascist would probably still not hold, because, as Jussi already indicated, what is still missing in the overall ideology of the Putinist regime is what is in this tradition of the International Association of Comparative Fascism called the palingenetic element, the sort of the idea of a newborn Russia, and of basically a national revolution. A debatable and very interesting issue here would be whether you would need actually, for such a regime transformation, Jussi indicated that whether you would need, then referring to the interwar experience, actually a broad grassroots fascist movement, or whether something like that could actually come from above. Yeah, so that was actually something that Stephen Shenfield already indicated in the 1990s in his reply to Hansen and Kopstein, where he said, well, fascistization can also happen not through a grassroots movement, not through a lot like the Nazi movement or the Italian fascist movement or the Iron Guard, and so something like that. That perhaps there are other ways of a rise of fascism that have not yet been sort of realized, and we could see something that was an almost prophetic prediction from that time in Russia. I would still, with many colleagues in comparative fascist studies, argue that the current regime in Russia does not yet fully fulfill the criteria of fascism. With a colleague we have earlier, before the war, with a German colleague who is an expert on German ultranationalism, German on the Weimar Republic and also on German Nazism. Steffen Keilitz at the Hannah Arendt Institute for Totalitarianism Studies in Dresden. We have published a couple of essays where we argued that perhaps the closest equivalent to Putin in the German interwar history is a man called Paul von Hindenburg, the imperial president who made Hitler the chancellor of Germany, but who was a representative, unlike Hitler, of the old regime, the Ancien regime, the Kaiser Germany. And although they are, of course, very different, Putin and Hindenburg, they are sort of in their biography somewhat similar in that they represent the old regime. In the Russian case, the Soviet regime, and in the German case, the imperial, the Kaiser regime. That has now somewhat changed. Well, Hindenburg died in 1934, so he could not implement his irredentist plan. So he represented a kind of German ultranationalism that was not fascist, but that was also clearly imperial and colonial and so on, that wanted to restore the German Empire. But Hindenburg never had the chance to implement his dream of a revanche for the losses after World War I. So we cannot know what Hindenburg would have been like if he had stayed in power and implemented his ideas in foreign affairs. What we have now is with a much younger Putin when he became president. So Hindenburg was also very different from Putin in that he was older than Putin. Is that Putin is actually implementing irredentist ideology that one could argue still is something that is more referring to the past than to the future and lacks the palingenetic element. It's more a rebirth of the imperial Russia than a new birth of an imperial Russia. It's not a new empire. However, what I think becomes even more problematic, and especially when Ukrainians use the term fascism, is that what Ukrainians experience in the occupied territories is, of course, something that very much reminds of German policies. The genocidal element there, deportations, the re-education, the mass murder, the torture, and so on, and basically the idea to remake the occupied territories and to sort of cleanse them, to liberate them, to have a sort of a new birth of these territories, also expressed in the term Novorossiya, which is of course an old term which refers to the Tsarist times. But here one could argue that, thank you, that this is actually something that gains a new meaning, Novorossiya, and that it has to be indeed a new Russia in these occupied territories. And here, in the experience of the Ukrainians, that is something that very much reminds of Nazi occupation policies, and where you could also argue that ideologically it is actually becoming something like fascism, because you have here this as I mentioned, genocidal element. You have this idea that this is actually a part of Russia that has been infiltrated by Western elements. And oddly, the Western elements here can be fascism again, or Nazism, yeah, and or Satanism and whatever, but also LGBT and homosexuality, individualism, liberalism, so you have all sorts of infiltration that is coming here from the West, and that this part of Russia needs to be cleansed from this spoiling, if you like, of Western Russia. So the odd thing is here that while we in analytical terms describe what Russia is doing very much in with such terms as imperialism, colonialism, irredentism, revanchism, that is not actually how the Russian leadership is thinking about it, or at least is presenting it. So this is not actually an imperial or colonial matter. It's actually a domestic matter of Russia, of the larger Russia that is larger than the Russian Federation, the recognized borders of the Russian Federation, that includes Belarus and Ukraine, at least eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, the Russian or in the past largely Russian-speaking parts, and that have to be liberated from this sort of overtake by Western ideas, Western values, Western culture, and so on, and that needs to be cleansed and be born anew. So here I think there could be an argument that indeed, if one wants to see the special operation as a domestic project within the larger Russia, that this could be then usefully called fascist in an informative way. Again, calling it fascist or not fascist is not about what is true and what is untrue here, but it's more the matter is it useful to do so? And because it has here a certain palingenetic element, there could be made an argument that this is actually a useful frame of reference, and then also a useful frame for comparison. Yeah. So you would then perhaps try to look for policies, let's say, inside Germany or in occupied territories where one could perhaps find similar elements that would highlight the dynamics of the processes on the ground. And the big question here is, of course, could this sort of fascist element that I think is there in this special operation, could that then sort of spread towards inner Russia, if you like, the Russian Federation itself? Could then the Russian regime itself fascistize itself? That is something we don't know. Unfortunately, I cannot exclude that this can happen either with Putin or without or after Putin, that we then could have a switch from demobilization that Jussi mentioned to mobilization, and to having a new birth actually within Russia, which would then be a cleansing, a sort of which would lead probably to mass terror in much larger scale than currently within the Russian Federation, and then would mean actually a fascistization. I would basically argue that something like that is possible without a large movement. So like revolutions are possible from above, I would also say a fascist revolution is also possible from above. You would not need first to have to create a mass movement to do that. That could, as we have seen in Russian history before, could be a revolution from above. But that is a speculation so far. Frankly, I don't think it's actually going to happen, because it's going to be economically rather difficult for Russia to go this way. A big difference to conclude maybe with that between today Russia and interwar Germany, that interwar Germany was a leading industrial, scientific, technological power in the world, whereas Russia is today a second-rate power that needs actually foreign trade, that needs foreign investment to develop itself, that has lots of internal problems that Germany did not have actually in that way, in terms of the functioning of its industry, its administration, its state, and so on. So yeah, let me finish with that.
Thank you so much for a very, I would say, provocative presentation. So since we don't have so much time, I will keep my comments and questions very brief, although I have much more. So I will start with Jussi's presentation and analysis. And I must confess, it was really hard for me to find any kind of, substantial critique, since I basically agree with most of your points, but I think it's very useful if you kind of clarify and if you share your insights and what you think about the following conundrum the Russian political regime is facing at the moment. This kind of, striking the balance between mobilization of certain groups of the population, certain groups of elites, at the same time keeping the rest demobilized. This is not it's not a very easy task, and I'm wondering, does the Kremlin and does the Russian political regime have the capacity and sufficient skill to play this out nicely? And I'm afraid, so given the fact that Russia is not governed in the best way possible, as we know, and Russia makes very serious mistakes, not only in the battlefields, but also when it comes to the governance and policy decision, policy making. So do you see any unintended consequences of this, politicization or excessive politicization? Could this radicalization actually lead the Kremlin to be trapped? We know that this is actually, and this is my bridge to Andreas's presentation, the nature of the Russian political regime. But before I do that, so let me just finalize the question for Jussi and my brief comment. So would this be the case that Kremlin would actually kind of, activate those groups that the apparently doesn't want to get activated? So, and if there are any groups like that, and, I'm obviously hinting at the right wing, and those groups actually that could clearly be called neo-fascists or fascists or ultranationalists, what kind of scenarios you see here, and should we take this really seriously or we shouldn't? So what's your estimation of the situation at the moment? And when we talk about the nature of Russian political regime and this debate around the very term fascism, so I came from a comparative politics studies, and I think Andreas also has a background in the very similar field. We actually came to the conclusion, I think when I say empirical political analyst, that personalist dictatorship is a pretty useful term. So it's just a kind of autocracy that revolves around one person who plays a role of a referee or a broker. This is something that Jussi also emphasized in his policy paper and in his talk. And also kind of, this is the nature of this patronal kind of relationship between different elites. Why I personally like this terminology? Because it really emphasizes the lack of institutionalization and the lack of clear procedures for decision making and the lack of checks and balances within the political regime. And in this sense, the nature of Russian regime hasn't changed that much. And this thought is really uncomfortable because we can't even imagine that as simplistic dictatorial regimes as that, very primitive, actually managed to start a full large-scale war and caused so much damage to the civilized world. So I think this is kind of, when we use the term fascist, sometimes I'm afraid that we really want to call this regime something else, kind of to label it negatively. But in terms of its substantial relationship between the different political actors, strategies, and resources being deployed, it's still the good old personalist dictatorship or autocracy in Barbara Geddes et al. Terminology. But of course, I do not actually kind of, ask you to multiply and to merge all these concepts all together. My question is, so you very reasonably asked, is it useful, and why we need these fascist concepts? What kind of process it helps us to explain? And here I have very serious doubts because I guess the Russian regime uses these ideologies very instrumentally. It does use different elements and kind of creates this patchwork of very inconsistent, backward-looking ideology. It's not a forward-looking ideology. And in this sense, it drastically differs from all kinds of fascist regimes. Although I feel very sympathetic to the comparison with the Weimar Republic, although we have no idea what could have happened with the German regime if the von Hindenburg actually would have stayed in power. But this is a nice historical analogy. Although I would like to throw another idea because I also kind of I was thinking a lot about this. What could be the most, I would say, comprehensive and insightful historical parallel, and I think it's former Yugoslavia. Exactly the same feeling of revanchism. Exactly, very, I would say, technologically advanced regime, comparatively speaking, during before the perestroika, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But then all the things got absolutely ugly in the early 90s. Genocidal war, these ideas of the Serbs being the kind of, superior towards others and so on and so forth. So I think this kind of, following Valery Bonsa's book, like a very old one, about subversive federalism. So this could be a very, I think, useful analogy, which is closer to our times, and which also kind of, with the same kind of anti-Americanism, revanchism, and ethnic-based identities, and trying to reinvent itself in these new post-communist realities. I'm just very curious what you think about it. And finally, I wanted to emphasize that Vladimir Putin actually doesn't look like a charismatic leader who could be, is capable of leading a proper fascist movement. So let's not compliment the person that much. So he is an apparatchik. He's not a charismatic leader. He's a flesh and bone of the Soviet system. And in this sense, let's not, I would say, overestimate the ability for the Russian regime to evolve into full-scale fashions in the way it actually happened, even in Italy. So I guess our internal humane desire to call Russian regime something bad and nasty, so should not be the prevalent motivation for the regime classification. Well, I have much more comments and questions for you, but I stop here because I hope we also have questions from the audience. So please, if you want me to read your questions, you can actually type them in the chat or just raise your hand. But before we do that, so I would like our speakers to respond.
Okay, if I start, I think you hit the nail. Those issues I certainly do not have an answer, and I mostly agree with you that I still see that the main strategy, or prevent use word strategy, because I think there is strategy. There is no strategy. It's kind of this sort of a tactical maneuvering, and that's the most skillful thing of the Putin regime. It's still about instrumentalization, but definitely now we see something kind of unprecedented features of that, and I think this simply shows, this is my view, that the political horizon that has been always extremely short in the Russian political thinking is now completely absent, and it's kind of the war itself provides a kind of logics of this kind of behavior. Of course, there are those megalomaniac maximalist plans by Putin, but still the system and this whole radicalization appears in that context. So in terms of whether Putin is ready to mobilize those circles, which are truly can be labeled as a fascist, I think there's still this kind of co-optation type of thinking. And I think these recent rumors around Prigozhin referred again that now some limits has been crossed and now there's try to downplay. But the question, of course, is that whether these players like Prigozhin and some others are able to kind of to strike back and to not to cope with the situation. And this is an open question. I think the biggest puzzle here is not Putin and the regime. The biggest puzzle is the Russian society. How is it possible that so poor, weakly governed system is able to consolidate its power and as you mentioned, to conduct this kind of world historical catastrophe, while the society itself still sees the kind of pragmatic solution for that is a kind of withdrawal and doing nothing, because I have always been against those views, seeing that Putin's regime is strong in one way or another. There are those nominal features of the strength, but in the actual situation, if there are 500,000 people in several cities on the streets to protesting, I think the game is over. But we're not seeing that, and I think this is the main issue. So maybe I stop here now and I give floor to Andreas.
Yeah, as I said, I mean the terms are now floating around, and the regime is in flux, and it's very confusing to me as well. So the and various terms can be more or less highlighting. It depends on also what you exactly refer to. So of course, I mean the regimes of Hitler and Mussolini were also personalistic dictatorships. One could argue they just had some specifics, and I would have, until a few years ago, I would have also largely agreed with these interpretations that were mentioned earlier, and that you also mentioned, that Putin is basically a cynic, and he is sort of using various ideas, that is, for instance, and various sort of images of himself and certain roles, that is very well illustrated in this older book on Putin by Fiona Hill and her co-author, whose name I've now also forgotten. By the way, the St. Petersburg sociologist whose name I could not remember a few minutes ago was Maxim Sokolov, who wrote this article, Izobretaya Ruski Fascism. So and I think Geddy was the co-author of Fiona Hill's book, so that where they describe these different sort of images of Putin that he's presenting, where they see these different Putins, if you like, in his role playing. But there was always, one could argue, something that was ideological in him. So, for instance, if you read this, one of his earliest books with him, this was a long interview of the journalist Gevorkyan, published in 2000. So he would be sort of a more or less a balanced speaker in this book until the matter is about Chechnya. Then he loses it in a way. You know, he becomes then suddenly very radical, and that is now also something when he talks about Ukraine and also many others. You know, they have like. So that is not any longer just cynical. I mean, either they're very good actors, you know, that they're playing this emotionality that comes through, or there is actually something more ideological, more emotional behind it. And if you think of these ideas also as purely instrumental, I don't think they explain the whole story anymore, because what they're now doing is actually bad for the regime. It's very risky. It doesn't really make sense anymore in terms of rational calculation. You know, they should have gone for a deal at a point, and maybe then, you know, but now they are in it, and they're sort of becoming maybe now infected by their own propaganda and are actually becoming more ideological. Unfortunately, I don't know enough about Yugoslavia. That's a very interesting issue here. There's certainly comparative. I mean, the comparison certainly makes sense, and people like Veljko Vujacic, they have for many years already compared Russian and Serbian imperial nationalism, and I'm still wondering whether, you know, you could compare this this Russian attitude towards Ukrainians to, let's say, the Serb attitude towards Croats or towards Bosniaks, because they are, as far as I understand, for the Serbians, sort of not part of Serbia, the Croats or the Bosniaks or the Kosovars. They are different people, whereas the Ukrainians are actually, they are not actually. It's just like the Bavarians in Germany or something like that. This is basically a regional Russian group that has unfortunately come under the influence of the West, and that needs to be born anew. You know, that is that needs to be cleansed and liberated and remade. And now we have this terminology where now Putin already, earlier he talked about shakals that are walking around the Western embassies. Now we have these terms like Jussi mentioned, scum and insects and things like that. So this is already, you know, that already reminds a lot about of Nazi Germany when you sort of go into that is not something central, I would say, to the domestic Russian regime so far. It would be also somewhat odd now for Putin himself to organize a national revolution inside Russia, because then people would ask, but you were in power almost for a quarter of a century. Why did you let, you know, all these insects and scums and so to say grow in Russia? You know, it would be sort of, he's already part of this, the current Russian Federation. So how can he now create a new Russian Federation? So that is, he is also in a bind here, I would say, by his own past. But perhaps with a new leader that could change for the worse, who would not be as much associated to the Russia of the last 25 years. So yeah, but then again, here the question is rather, you know, what does it give us to use these terms? It's not about is it true, is it false? It's more, does it make sense? Does it open some cognitive windows, if you like, to better understand, and then perhaps also to adequately compare what is happening?
Thank you so much for a very detailed and comprehensive answer. So just very quickly, I completely agree with you that Putin clearly has something personal about Ukraine. So it's just, I have no doubt about that. So, and clearly, I wouldn't say that it's not rational to behave the way, but the problem of all authoritarian regimes that the whole decision-making process is intrinsically flawed. So this is why it actually is, it's more prone for all kinds of mistakes and miscalculations. So in this sense, it's both, of course, instrumental and kind of quasi-ideological, inconsistent ideological, personal feelings of Putin as, you know, not very well educated in terms of history, right? Education person. So yeah, here I absolutely agree, just to clarify, but we still have time to pick a few questions. So, and there are 2 comments and / questions in the chat. From Olli Ruohomäki. So Jussi talked about the return to the Soviet era, back to the USSR, as a famous Beatles song goes. Seriously speaking, how will the age cohort / elite that has been used to traveling to the West and exposure to the Western world react in the long term? Will they just accept the state of affairs and resign to their fate? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Olli. It's a very central question, and I think I tend to think that we see sooner or later some kind of manifestations of that conflict, and then what I referred about this spin dictatorship was a kind of a gradual or authoritarian regression. As a thought that it used to be the idea to kind of integrate these changing society and new kind of influences, this early Putinism, and this always of this Surkovian type of manipulation of combining this sort of a Russian Sondervegism with Western influences and all kinds of that. And now we have shifted to more and more Soviet by aging regime. So I think this is something which calls make the kind of hypothetical or almost a theoretical the kind of considerations that whether, which actually Andreas mentioned, that it's a good point, that whether the fascist regime is possible without grassroots movement, but I think it's still kind of a distant thing in a way of that we see such a gap between the actual decision making, the real regime, the governing bodies, and the rest of the society. The other question is that whether it's ready to adapt, and this is make me more pessimistic regarding that people are still kind of society at large able to conform and to adapt with the situation. And most pessimists say that yeah, the Russians are always, because they are kind of this sort of a slave mentality or whatever. I don't believe that in a sense, because this is a kind of a new situation in a way of that at some point it might change, but I would conclude that I'm sure that at some point this sort of a generational cleavage and conflict will appear, but what are the actual consequences of that? I don't know that.
It's a very good point about generational clash. This is something we observe in the survey data we collect. So this is, but we still the last question we can pick before we close our seminar from Mikko Räköläinen from Tampere. If possible, I'd like to hear your views. I guess your means both of you, both of the speakers, on Mark Galeotti's argument that Russia currently doesn't have an ideology. He argued that Putinism is just a narrative of how Russia has been done wrong since the 90s, but it isn't an ideology because it doesn't prescribe or proscribe means or intermediate goals, which is why the Russian state can use this patchwork of ideas and means. So what is your take? I know you partially answered this, but if you have anything else to say.
Well, I can shortly. I think that Andreas has a much more and provocative. I think this is the one, maybe the very point of organizing this kind of webinar, because this is something which is now perhaps is changing, and I still think that there is no ideology. And if you take an example for this constitutional reform, I think it was still this kind of rather ridiculous ideological declaration regarding the main point. And the good indication was that when they printed these new constitutions, there was absent this mention of this resetting the presidential terms. So actually the main point was hidden from the audience. And what it was amendments. It was not totally a new constitution. So this Yeltsin liberal constitution is still there, the first 2 chapters, And then there is this sort of a conservative embellishment. So actually this shows this kind of still the old cute Putinism in that way, that they can impose all kinds of ideas. But on the other hand, I think that the regime is becoming, and Putin himself has become more ideological, but he still cannot find a way. Maybe it's still he's looking for a way of how to operationalize these ideological viewpoints and radicalization into practice, because it still follows those old instrumentalizing cynical practices.
Okay, Andres?
Yeah, so the regime has always been between Dugin and Roldugin, and so there was, you know, I mean, you had this sort of the clearly just the kleptocratic, if you like, and the idiocratic poles. And a few years ago, I would have largely agreed that there was no real ideology. It was sort of very much fluid, and as I mentioned, there was then this idea that Putinism is a mentality rather than an ideology. But in recent years, even before the large invasion, I think that I mean, what we hear from representatives of the Russian regimes has now become much more coherent and sort of going all in the same direction. My colleague Martin Krag and me, we have just done a study of the rhetoric of Nikolai Patrushev and Sergei Naryshkin until 2020, until before the constitutional change, and they already, you know, you see that also in their evolution, that they sort of they zoom into this more and more anti-Western civilizational conflict, and they sort of express it in different ways, but there's very little actually variation then at the end in their in the ideas that they express. How to label it best, I'm not sure. That is still not, at least not in the sort of in the larger framework, that is still not fascism. I would not yet label it that way. The rhetoric about Ukraine is fascist, I would argue, and also the policies are actually fascist. But the larger sort of state ideology is not yet fascist, but it is an ideology. I don't think it's just you know, a narrative or a mentality anymore. It's a more or less clear explanation of the past and future and present of Russia and the world, and I don't see that much contradiction anymore, as there was in the 2000s. There was clear contradiction, and you had these different towers and camps, and you know, the liberals and the Siloviki and this, and you know, Putin was then also expressing these different ideas. You know, when he went to the Bundestag and had a speech there, that was certainly something different than when he spoke to domestic audiences. But now, recently, at the Valdai Club, at the you know, the annual various speeches that Putin gives, and also the people around him, that is now very sort of congruent. And you know, it's maybe we cannot it's not easily perhaps to classify and terminologically conceptualize it, but I think it is coherent enough for me to call it an ideology.
All right, so we have 1 minute left, and it's exactly the amount of time when we actually can thank our speakers and our audience for wonderful discussion. And I hope it was useful, and this kind of debates, seminars will help us to make sense of the new realities we found ourselves 1 year ago. Thank you very much, and please join us next time. Thank you, Jussi. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you.